You're in back-to-back meetings all day long. You're trying to stay present, but you're also worried you'll forget the action item or the critical next step. That's where Granola comes in. Granola is an AI-powered notepad for meetings. With Granola, just jot down rough notes like you always do. In the background, Granola transcribes and turns them into clear, useful takeaways as soon as the meeting ends. You can even chat with your notes during or after the call. Ask Granola to help you negotiate, write a follow-up email, or even coach you using recipes. Once you use it on the first meeting, it's hard to go without Granola.
Hey everyone, even in 2026, when fintechs can spin up cards in minutes and move money across borders in real time, it's still hard to decipher transactions. That's why financial institutions turn to Spade. Spade is the data and AI platform that turns messy transaction strings into structured, verified records in real time. To learn more, head to spade.com. That's SPADE.com. Hey everyone, Julie VerHage-Greenberg here, back with This Week in Fintech, which is now also a Plaid company. Nothing is changing that I know of at this point, maybe just more podcasts and stuff in the future, but all good things. Lauren actually texted me that day. She's like, congrats on being acquired by Plaid, since one of Lauren's former companies was also acquired by Plaid. At some point, everyone just ends up working for Plaid, right? If you're in fintech long enough. But I am back with my co-host Lauren for another episode of our Fintech OGs. And today we have one of her bosses, Oban MacTavish, who is a co-founder of Spade. And we have Alan Miller, who is from Oak HCFT. They have invested in a bunch of different fintech companies. Some of them that you might know would be Blend, Bridge, which was acquired by Stripe. Blend obviously went public, FastPay, and Paxos. And one of their most recent investments is Spade. So I have to start. When did you guys meet? Was it for this investment, or have you guys known each other for a while since you've both been in fintech for a while at this point?
I'd be really curious to see what you remember, Oban. But I was sort of going back through my emails. I think what happened is, we invest in a lot of fintech infrastructure companies. That's kind of like a little bit of our bread and butter, B2B applications and infrastructure. And I think I had seen an announcement, and I think it was around your seed round. And I think I actually cold emailed you just to say hi and catch up and all that. That was, I think, 3 years ago, 23. And then I think we had sort of like interactions on and off. And then the next kind of clear memory for me was Money 2020, I guess, this past year, when we sort of sat down, and I think Tess came as well. And that was like a big aha moment for me, at least. And that's, I think, what started to lead to some more deeper discussions about this round. But does that kind of generally sound about right?
Yeah, I think that's how I remember it too. I know we spoke. I remember I went to the Oak offices. This is back when I still lived in Vancouver. I was visiting New York to do the whole, do the rounds, as many founders do if they don't live in the States. And I met you at the Oak offices because it was after we had raised our seed round. I think maybe I want to say, 23, so post seed round, before we had raised our A, as we were sort of figuring things out. And then, I agree, the next big thing. And then I feel like there might have been something in the middle there, like early 25, pre-money 2020, as things we were just sort of talking about what our plan was. And then 25 was like, hey, we did the thing we said we were going to do, and even better. So it's always nice you can show up and have that conversation. But yeah, so I think it's been a long time, actually. It's been 3 years, I guess.
It's wild that 2023 was already 3 years ago. I'm like, wait, that doesn't feel like that. I'm just like, whoa. Let's take another step back then. And how did each of you first start out in fintech then? Since obviously, Alan, you've only been at Oak since I think it was like 2019. And then Oban, you have been at previous fintechs before co-founding Spade in this space too. So Alan, maybe we start with you.
Yeah, sure. So my journey to fintech, I got to go all the way back to, I think it was like 2013. So I had been living in New York City, and was going to business school at Columbia. And I think one of the very first fintech companies, one of the first notable fintech companies, was a company called Betterment, the robo-advisor. And I had downloaded the app. I think I was one of the first couple hundred users of the app. And it started using it and playing around with it, and kind of got just really interested from like a consumer perspective in fintech from that regard. Then when I went to business school, the founder of Betterment, John Stein, was actually a CBS alum. And I was like, well, I would love to like, do something while I'm in school, like on the side, nights and weekends, kind of like a side hustle type of thing. And I cold emailed John, just be like, hey, I'd love to just do something here. And as part of this program called Insight, which kind of helps, place students at startups and do project work and all that stuff. So I actually ended up spending my second year in business school working with his co-founder, Eli Breverman, and a few others on a few different things inside of Betterment. And so that was like my first sort of, foray into it. And then there it kind of went into being a consultant and then ultimately an investor. But yeah, that was my journey.
Very cool. Check out season 1 of Fintech OGs for an episode with it was John Stein and Alexa Von Tobel. So,
oh really?
Oban,
okay, I'll have to do.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oban, what about you?
Those are real Fintech OGs. Right out of college, I co-founded a company called Hubly, and we were selling efficiency tech, like think like practice management software, very similar to what you'd see in like a doctor's office or a dentist's office, to wealth managers. And then we started that, I guess that was 2018. So not a decade yet. I guess it's 8 years ago. Did that
very
for
close,
a couple years.
Very
close. I know. Makes me feel old.
It's going to be really weird when we look back and like COVID was a decade ago, and we're not that far away from that either.
Yeah.
Continue.
No, so we were selling that, and then I think that's technically considered fintech. And then we did Barclays Techstars in New York in 2019. And that was my first time living in New York. We lived in like, I think my bedroom was literally 7 feet by 5 feet. So it was like a tiny rectangle in Chinatown. It was it was very cool. That was the first time I ever touched fintech, and was sort of the thing that led to Spade, which is very funny because I met a bunch of other fintech founders at Techstars. It was also sponsored by Barclays. So there's a lot of like Barclays connectivity. And that was our first sort of touch point into like the actual fintech universe, especially because as a Canadian, like Canada doesn't have a big universe of fintech companies. There's a couple now, and like I think it's becoming a bigger thing. But back then, I think there was literally Coho, and that was it. Like there wasn't really fintech coming out of Canada, so it was kind of alien coming to the States and hearing about all these like Cash App, Venmo, these things that sound so far away when you live there because it doesn't exist in Canada. So that was the first time I really started engaging with fintech.
So did you move to New York and then move back to Vancouver for a little bit before? Okay, walk me through that a little bit too.
So we moved to New York for Techstars, and then moved back to Vancouver, and then kept sort of trying to build a company. I mean, it was a very different time. And then COVID happened, like COVID really kicked off. So we literally did it like until December 2019, went back to Vancouver. And then 3 months later, March 2020, I guess, was when things really happened. We were trying to raise a seed round at the time. So that was a whole experience. I wasn't fundraising. That was one of my other co-founders. I was really trying to like, at that point, like trying to keep the lights on and figure out like, what do we need to build to, actually sell to financial advisors. But it was very bizarre. It was very like, you go New York, especially New York fintech, I think in like that time was also like incredibly in person. Like it was a very cool time. It was like a lot of energy around it. And then obviously COVID, I was back in Vancouver. My first company is like, it's $0 left, like literally zero. Decided to step away from that, figure out what I wanted to do, and then sort of like stumbled my way towards Spade over the course of the next, I guess, 2 years from that point. So it was a very, very interesting experience, but it was I feel like once you touch fintech, you never really want to leave. At least I didn't. You sort of you see this whole world open up in front of you, and you're like, wait, this is like this weird universe with this cast of characters who always sort of pop up, and these, like, it feels very like, you're like, oh, this is like a world within a world. Tech is so broad, but fintech is this nice little niche that is also happens to be one of the biggest industries in the entire planet. So yeah, that was quite the journey I went through to eventually end up building a fintech infrastructure company, having never worked in payments before.
That's a wild, like 5 years right there. Not like 3 to 5 years. Yeah.
I feel like you can't leave us hanging. Now you got to explain like the origin story of Spade.
Yeah. Spade was really born out of a weird in-between time when, I just left my first company, was really trying to like move away from tech. I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. Too hard. No, but I think when you're building a company, at least for me, I think you figure out pretty quickly, like, do I want to do this the rest of my life? Like, you're raising money from venture capitalists, there's all this momentum, things are going well, and then things are tough. And, eventually, I think for me, you step back and you're like, I don't know if this is my life's work. So that was my first company. I was like, I don't know, 2 years in, I don't know if I can be like, hey, we're going to go out and raise even more money and keep building and like do this for the rest of my life. Because I feel like that's kind of the commitment you're making. So I was like, no, I'm going to step away. I'm going to go do the whole like finance thing. I'm going to apply for jobs on Wall Street, do that. But thankfully, I was literally trying to pay the bills. Like I was going to all these fintech founders who I met through Barclays Techstars and was like, hey, like, do you need like pitch decks? Do you need like business development stuff? Do you need like sales materials? Do you need me to like run around and do market sizing? I don't know, just like literally anything so that I could literally pay rent. And they were all, I found a bunch of odd jobs and that was cool. And they were all just complaining about their data, literally just like 24/7. Because at this point, this was like neobank heyday. Everybody was a neobank. Everyone was building their special rewards program. Everyone wanted to build the like Cash App experience. And, we were like, hey, what if we could just build an API that would just like give them logos, nothing else? These little logos, how hard would that be? And that was really where Spade was born. It was like this idea that at that moment was like, there was so much fintech demand and everyone was trying to do really interesting things and they needed better data to do it. And it started with user experience and it obviously grew very, very quickly outside of that. And it was one of those moments where I feel like I saw what I think is still is the biggest market or one of the biggest markets in financial technology is like, data is built, so much of what we do is built on top of data and it's all bad data. And this just feels like a problem that should be solved. And I was absolutely shocked it wasn't solved at that point. I was like, okay, you do that for a couple months, you have suddenly signed all these people. You're like, oh, maybe there's like a huge opportunity here. And that was really the number one thing for me when I was like, if I was ever going to do this again, I want to be doing something in such a big market that is like undeniably large. And I think that's what we found here at Spade.
Yeah, that's great. And Alan, I guess, Oban's talking about what he found really shocking. Has there been something in fintech that you found really shocking that like, why hasn't this been solved?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because going back to that first meeting, right, 3 years ago, I came away from that meeting being kind of like, well, Oban's great. This is a really incredible founder. We'd love to be in business with a guy like him. But this is like a problem that's like hard, like really hard. And so much so that there have been other players that have tried to do things similar kind of on the edges of this and haven't really worked out. So, I was a little bit skeptical that this would actually kind of come to life and all that. But thankfully, Oban, we were able to stay in touch and he was obviously able to deliver in a very big way. But look, at Oak, we like things that are hard, right? I mean, if you look at most of our portfolio, it tends to be infrastructure. It tends to be B2B applications. It tends to be in highly regulated areas. A lot of our portfolio deals with areas like fraud. One of Spade's biggest use cases is around fraud and authorization. And so we tend to gravitate a little bit to things that are very hard, technically hard, from a compliance and governance perspective, because that's where you can build really interesting. If you can crack it, right, and if you can solve these hard problems, that leads to a moat, and then eventually you can scale that and serve all sorts of really interesting customers. So we were drawn to the fact that it was hard, and it was hard across a bunch of dimensions, right? Like first, you have to build the coverage, right? There's a whole bunch of just merchant coverage you have to build. You've got to be accurate, right? You've got to have the depth of the coverage, meaning the actual attributes that Spade actually returns, which Oban can talk about, and then the speed, right? Having low latency and being able to sort of respond in real time. And the fact that, Spade had kind of built this capability across all four of these kind of attributes was really compelling. And then, of course, last year they had a lot of momentum, thanks in part to you, Lauren, on the go-to-market side, and picked up some really interesting logos, Stripe and Cash App and FIS and a bunch of other really interesting customers. So that was really exciting. And I think we're now really excited to see what this all goes from here.
Oban, so you mentioned how you'd never been in payments before. This was kind of like your first foray into it. And Alan mentioned that this is a hard problem to solve, which is part of the reason that no one had done it before you. Other than, the first thing that comes to mind on why this is hard is that transaction data is messy, right? Like if I look at my Amex statement versus my Chase statement, the same company that I'm buying something from could look different. Uber, it might be a ride, it might be Uber Eats, that gets qualified as different things, etc. If I'm doing like a PFM, what else is really hard about it, and why do you think, what have been some of the keys to being able to overcome those challenges and actually build this, scale this, and make it work?
I think it goes back to a little bit of what Alan said, is that I think a lot of people approach this problem as like an ML problem. They're like, give me all the transaction data in the world and I'm going to train a model and I'm going to fix all this data. And like, if that actually worked, we wouldn't exist because Visa and MasterCard have infinitely more transaction data than anybody. And if that had worked, Chase wouldn't need a vendor and Cash App wouldn't need a vendor. And a startup couldn't do it because you're always going to have less data than the people you're trying to sell to because they're that far ahead of you. And we really did it the other side, and part of that the other way, which is the part of it was that we had no venture capital and we were just a couple people. So we were hand labeling data. And if you don't have any transaction data, it's sort of like the requirement is that you have to figure out another way to do this. So we figured, well, what if you turned this into something that looked a lot more like a search problem, where like Google went out and indexed all the entirety of the internet, and then you put something in and they surface you the most, like the thing they think you're looking for really. And they score a bunch of these things and they give you the most likely answer. And that's what we did with transaction enrichment. And I think the hard part about that is that it is kind of counterintuitive to how other people had done the problem. But ironically, because I had absolutely no experience in payments, did not come from like a big company that had been trying to do this, I approached it in the only way that made sense, which is like, well, let's just hand label a bunch of data and then get really good at figuring out if this is that. And then you can sell it to people. And we found really quickly it was amazing. But obviously, once you do it that way, it becomes a very different kind of business. You know, it's about how can I source, clean, and verify millions and millions of business records, constantly update them, and then make sure you're matching things correctly, which is a very different problem, but it's really hard. It's one of the reasons we've stayed really focused historically on the US, and then recently we expanded to Canada, was because it is actually a very challenging problem. And I think obviously that was a pretty unique insight, and to pat myself on the back there. But once we started doing it, I think you realize that it is a much harder way to solve the problem. And that's why people hadn't tried to do it historically. And it's why someone like an Amex is so successful at it. Because, Amex. Do you
remember that moment where you had that realization? Like literally, like walk me, like when did it just like go off in your brain?
Well, I wish I was like, Nostradamus and was like, oh yeah, this is the way. I think genuinely what happened was that I was talking to a fintech founder friend of mine. He was like, oh, we don't have any logos in our transactions. We want to build this user experience. I was like, oh, if I gave you an API that did that, like, would you pay us? And he was, yes. The funny part is we weren't an incorporated business, so we couldn't accept any payment for a really long time. So he didn't pay me any money, but we were able to do it. And what it came down to is I was sitting there with one of my co-founders, Cooper, being like, okay, so how are we going to do this? I'm like, well, what if we just like, okay, AI doesn't exist at this point. So like, it's really, really long time ago. And we're like, okay, let's just Google and like find all the lists of every single, like the most transacted app businesses across the US. Okay, we'll do it. Because this is like a neobank. And we did it. We found all the lists. And then, we spun up some infrastructure. We built a little a user experience where we can input all this important information. We just started, you start labeling and making your own data. You human label, human acquire, download. I got really good at Photoshop. Actually, no, it wasn't Photoshop because we couldn't afford Photoshop. We got this. There's a website called Photopea, which I'm going to plug here. It's like free Photoshop in a website where you could like take things and edit photos for like, cropping all the logos so they would fit nicely, typing it all up, getting the websites, doing all these things. And then, one of my co-founders, Cooper, who's I guess far smarter than I was, he was the one doing the much more challenging thing of like, okay, how do we match these things? And we started literally being, okay, how many ways could this appear? Let's write all this regex. And we're really going through doing this by hand. And then they did a comparison between us and a venture-backed competitor of ours at that point that had raised millions of dollars, and we absolutely crushed them. And it was a very funny moment because we didn't even know this was happening. And I get like a Slack from my friend being like, hey, we compared you against unnamed competitor. And you guys were way better. Like, how did you do that? And I was like, oh, it's just,
Is that competitor still around or no?
In a form, I guess. I don't know if they would, okay. We don't see them anymore, but I think they technically exist.
Okay. They might have pivoted a little bit since
that's a nice way to say it.
Companies were better at doing what they were doing.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Right. Very cool. Was there ever a moment, like once you had come across that realization, where you thought maybe that realization wasn't right, or that it would be too hard to do all those things that need to come true to make that work?
Yeah. Well, when you hit like merchant 1,500 and you realize there's like millions left to go, I think you're sort of looking at a daunting task and like, I don't know if this is going to work. And then we tried to we were like, okay, now people want location data. Like, how do you go about doing this? And then you start scraping using, what's it called? Store locators or some fun stuff you can do with that. But then now you get the data validation problem. We still had no money through this whole thing. So you're sort of being like, okay, this is like the least scalable thing on the planet. How many people do we have to hire to label this stuff? And then eventually you raise money and then you go and acquire the data from elsewhere, which is a far more intelligent decision. But there was definitely times along the way where you're adding customers and you're realizing that like a business customer, so a small business cards looks very different from a consumer card company, which looks very different from a this. And like, suddenly the merchants they care about look very different. And there's this moment we were sitting around being like, I don't know if this is possible. Once we get acquired data, and then you can start scaling these things very differently once you have capital. But there was a moment when you're adding on new customers and your performance goes from like, oh, we did it, we got someone to 80% over here. And this new person comes in and it's 40%. And you're like, oh my God, like that's not a business. That's like, I don't even know what that is. That's like a trial that we have to continue doing and labeling this data. But, you figure it out.
You also make a good point. Like none of you guys had some big exit before starting this company. So it's more like, you guys were kind of like Max Levchin starting PayPal versus Max Levchin starting Affirm, right? Like when he started Affirm, he didn't have to worry about paying his rent and all. He was fine. Whereas you guys are more like PayPal. I assume he didn't have a ton of money at that point when he was starting that company.
No. And you're not an incorporated business and you're like, you're trying your best, but you kind of need some money to make these things really work. You're like hoping the infrastructure doesn't go down.
Because it's a story of like necessity plus serendipity coming together, and obviously the insight that you had to like, hey, there's something here, right, to go pursue. So yeah, amazing story.
Yeah, and just because I'm self-preservation here, our match rate is certainly well beyond 80% now. So there's a little caveat that we've come a long way.
We are talking about 2022 at this, or 2021 at this point. So yeah.
Yeah. And probably even on that like small part of the journey that you just went through, there were a lot of highs and lows, but maybe zooming out more. And Alan, why don't we start with you? If you could talk us through your career highs and your career lows, we'd love to really understand what your journey in fintech has looked like.
Yeah. Let's start with the lows so we can end with the highs. It's hard to not. So I've been at Oak since 2019. In a lot of ways, that was kind of like a weird time to like join. And I started in venture in 2017. But kind of like immediately, we had this kind of like once in a generational thing happen, right? Which is COVID, which for a brief moment it was unclear what was going to happen. We had this massive acceleration. And then we entered this like fintech winter, right? Like 22, 23. I mean, these were really, really hard, years. And, being an investor and Oak being an investor in a number of companies trying to survive this, that was really hard. I mean, there were a lot of very difficult conversations with companies. And again, we, as fintech investors, you are exposed to lots of different business models, right? You've got software as a service, a little bit more recurring. You've got payments, a little bit less recurring. You got lending businesses. You got consumer. You got application. You have infrastructure. So we had companies all over the map. And in general, I would say those were, we certainly had companies that have come out of that and thrived and been better for it. But along the way, even the companies that did come out much stronger did have to make a lot of tough decisions. So there were a lot of meetings, in that 2-year period that were just painful, and just talking about doing the hard things around, hey, we've got to like deprioritize the roadmap, and we've got to probably let go of some of our valuable employees, and we've got to figure out how we're going to survive. So that was. And
Alan, this is your first time being a venture investor too, right?
I had done a small stint at a firm called Matrix Partners before joining Oak for 2 years. But coming to Oak.
But like that's just those are such hard conversations to have, not just because like in general they're hard, but too like COVID was something no one could see coming, right? It's not like, there was anything you could have done to prevent the business going the way it did in most of those cases, I assume.
Yeah, I mean, there is of course, you can always say, hey, there are certain businesses that are like e-commerce, for example, or the mortgage world, right? There's a certain level of cyclicality. But this was sort of just like an unprecedented thing that had happened to the world, right? And then you compound that with, then the SVB thing happened and a few other things kind of. So it's just sort of like one thing after another. And we were all sort of navigating this for the first time. I think a lot of founders, even if you were a repeat founder, you were navigating this, for the first time. And I think fintech is a little nuanced in the sense that like in SaaS, for example, you have recurring revenue. Everything kind of is relatively, I wouldn't say totally predictable, but it's more predictable than like payments. If your payment volume is up 1 month and chugging along, and then all of a sudden because of an external factor, it kind of goes to zero. You don't have that sort of recurring kind of sort of sticky revenue base. You have to kind of figure out new ways to grow and just basically survive. So we did have companies in that situation. So that was very, very, sort of challenging, I would say, to kind of to navigate.
Well, it's like, imagine if SoFi had been founded in 2019 versus 2011 and they were still just doing student loans, like SoFi probably wouldn't exist anymore at that point, given the moratorium on like all debt there was no interest rates, student loan collections were paused. It's like, what would SoFi do? There would be no point to go refinance your loan.
Yeah, Julie, I think this is like a really broader important point of like the time when you start. There's a lot of skill involved. There's a lot of like founders who are resilient and can see around corners. But like literally the time you start the business can make the world of a difference. You start business, I think of like right now, right? Like you started business in 23, 24, 25, kind of a different era than if you started, let's say, 2019, right? Or 2020. And I even think of the last big wave of like innovation that we have, which is really cloud SaaS applications, like starting a business in that area around 2010, 2011, and being able to basically kind of enjoy this like 10-year run would be a lot different than starting a SaaS business, a SaaS application, let's say, in 2020. So there's a timing component here that is what it is, right? So that was, that 22, 23 era, a lot of just navigating things that were not necessarily foreseeable, that were just new, and a lot of like personnel decisions that were personal in nature, right? So that was kind of a very sort of hard thing to do, I think. I guess on the flip side of that, maybe the positive is kind of seeing, I'm on the board of about 8 companies now, and seeing a lot of these companies emerge from that time period. Some of them had to do the very tough things, getting lean, to then grow again and scale again. I've seen a number of these companies kind of weather that storm, get capitalized further after 2 or 3 or 4 years of not having much capital, and then seeing these businesses kind of like take on a new shape, a new form, and have like almost a second life, and rebound, in some cases do like even better than they were, much better than they were before. That's been like a really like great thing to see. And the other thing is like I have invested outside of the area quite significantly, like Latin America or in Canada, and places that you would expect some of those companies have really big players in their markets. That's been a real joy, to see over the years.
Oban, I want to add on to your answer for the low. And do you think you guys started Spade at the correct time? Just since we were talking about timing and stuff too, do you like if you could, would you start it sooner or later? Just given that AI obviously would have helped you do a lot of those list making, etc. Then, but someone else could have came up with the idea before you did.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start, we definitely weren't the first. Like, we had competitors. I think it was
unnamed competitors.
Unnamed competitors, really exactly. The graveyard, as we like to call them. It's a great question. I think in so much that like it's turned out really well, which is great. I do think it was a really challenging time to start a company, though. We did raise at probably the peak. Like if you look at like fintech valuation, we raised our seed like March 22. And had the great fortune of partnering with Andreessen Horowitz very early in our life cycle. But then you hit fintech winter and a massive, massive pullback. And we had to navigate, and like, talking about lows, like we had to navigate a huge chunk of our earliest customers, like evaporate instantly. Like we're really lucky because we made some decisions. Like if you think about the life cycle of Spade, we raised our pre-seed in November of 21 from Gradient Ventures. We had Y Combinator, immediately raised our seed, had a bunch of money in the bank, and had literally 0 employees. So we immediately had to sort of go from being like this small thing that was growing very quickly to like a company. And then we literally built, but we just had to build. And we went around, we built, and we spent a lot of time like actually building technology, and went really quiet. And then 2023 is when we sort of like reintroduced ourselves in the market and started selling. And then everyone went bankrupt. So that was really, really hard. Like there was definitely a moment where not only did we have to change our product, we initially were like, we're going to do what everyone else was doing in the market, which is we're going to do all types of data. We're going to do Plaid data. I mean, Plaid was having a moment, obviously. Everyone was a PFM. Everyone was like, aggregate data. So we were doing all kinds of data. And we had to be like, well, we're not going to do that because there's no money there. And all of the startups who do it are going bankrupt. And we had to make that decision like in the span of a week, because we also knew that if we wanted to start selling to like mid-market fintechs who were going to survive, who had money, you had to start those conversations. They weren't going to convert. And if you look at our growth in 2023, we didn't grow. Like there was a period of time where like our revenue was essentially flat. And that was just because we were making up for people either reducing their volume, going bankrupt, spending, like it was a really, really challenging time. And I think, you learn a lot in those moments about like building a business that actually makes money and realizing that like growth is like, the slope of your curve is super, super important, but it's also about building like an actual sustainable business. People want to pay you for a thing. And if someone, it's why some of these AI companies are so fascinating, because it does feel a little bit like they're like, this all seems, the music is going, so everyone's spending all this money, but the moment it disappears, it's all going to collapse. And I think in fintech, we had that moment, and it was a super dark time. So I think you learn a lot, and it builds a certain level of resilience to go through those types of things. But there's probably better eras to start the company or easier times.
If it had been the AI era, it would have been easier to just not do it the hard way, which I feel like is kind of our I don't know, our magic element is that like, it wasn't an AI problem. It was the search problem that you talk about, and like seeding enrichment with an actual verified database. Because, I was kind of behind the scenes for this journey, started advising you in 23, 22?
No, it was 22. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like from my perspective, I feel like that actually brought such a unique element to Spade. Like, even in my excitement joining full time is like this idea that like there is an actual value asset in our data asset, which I think is really unique in fintech. So, but tell us about your high.
I've never been more excited than right now, which is maybe like the best fun answer. But I do think it felt like we were living in this future state. I think I like to say like either people would instantly buy our product, or they would just be like kind of confounded by the idea of like why they would want better data for quite a long time. Like, I think we look really smart right now, and that's great. We're so smart. We were living in like this future state. But I do think people, very similar to many infrastructure companies, like you're trying to convince people that there will come a time in the future when they're going to desperately need your product. Like I think, as I'm sort of like a bit of a crypto hater or whatever, but I think the stablecoin people see it in the same way, right? Like they're seeing this future state and trying to bring customers along to that. And you'll find these like super innovative companies. And like we've been so lucky to partner with people like a Mercury a long time ago, when like now they're a juggernaut and now they're crushing it. But there was moments where like there was no guarantee. And I think you find these people who are doing something in the future that requires technology that doesn't exist everywhere. I mean, you look at Stripe, same thing. They were working with these tiny YC companies who were like, we're selling something online, and not everyone was doing that. And I think we were lucky enough to do that. But now we're living in an era where like it is a requirement. Like whether or not we want it to, this weird Pandora's box of AI is like here to stay. And industries are changing, and financial services as sort of slow moving and as large of a behemoth it will get there. And I think there's an understanding among many of our banking customers who are like not just the JP Morgan Chases of the world. We're talking about the top 20, we're talking about the top 50, top 200 banks who are looking at this thing. Okay, great. In 5 years, we're still going to be here. And for that, we need better data. And I think that's like, there's never been a more fun time in Spade's history, because there's obviously like, there's the ego being like, great, we did it. Yeah, we were right. But there's also that sense of like, okay, it's pretty amazing to see people who normally I would have expected to be like sort of dismissive of us being like the people most excited about it. I think it's a very special feeling when you get to walk into rooms with people who never thought you could sell to, and they're actually just like desperately interested in buying your software. And I think that's a very special moment. And we feel really lucky that like we get to ride that wave, but also we get to like come along on that journey with so many people who are innovating for, millions and millions of customers. So yeah, it's a great time. Right now is probably my favorite time.
You mentioned again that you're a crypto hater, and I forgot that. And it just reminded me, we have all this data on like the blockchain. You're going to have stablecoin data and stuff now. How does Spade play into that? Like, is it, this is again from someone that's just like looking at the outside. I'm super not technical and don't understand all the nitty gritty of it. I understand like transaction data a little bit, but I haven't been super into crypto or anything. So I would say I'm not enough either way to say if I'm a hater or a lover at this point. But how would Spade play any sort of role in like blockchain or stablecoin data?
This is so perfect because I literally seeded a conversation in the product channel with one of our eager engineers yesterday, and I don't know if it's come back to me yet. So
I don't know enough about like my quizzical, or I guess my maybe skepticism, I guess, of like stable coins is not necessarily that it is bad technology. It's that I don't know where that market's going to go. And I can't really pretend to be a massive expert in it. I think it is interesting. I think the thing we think about, and like pivoting the question slightly, is like, I don't think we play a huge role in some of these systems because we're not experts in the space. It doesn't mean we couldn't. But I think when you're building a company, and like now that we're at the stage we are, like our customers rely on us. And like, as much as I love going down like a rabbit hole and like throwing some stuff together, and like half of Lauren's job is being like, no, we need to like sell this stuff. So you certainly cannot just like, we need to be building stuff for our customers. I'm like, yeah, that's actually true. Like we need to stay focused. And I think as an answer, like maybe in a world where stable coins become a significant portion of payments volume for our largest customers, of course, we would support them better understanding who and for what purpose people are transacting with these financial instruments, because that's really what they are. Like they're just means of commerce, and a card is very similar to a stable coin in many ways. I think the thing we're excited about is like, when you look in the future, like agentic commerce and things like that, we have a lot of data, and helping our customers figure out who they should be letting these little AI agents transact with, if that's the future we're moving towards, is something we are in a very, very strong position to help with, even if that transaction is happening with a stable coin built on one of these many, many, many protocols, or if it's happening with a card or an ACH or a wire. Like deeply understanding who someone is transacting with is something we've been doing for a long time, and we do billions of times every single month. And I think that doesn't matter really what the medium of exchange is. We'll figure out how to help our customers do it. So not an expert, and maybe calling myself a hater is like, I don't know if I should go on the record saying that. I think I am actually. There was some interview.
A skeptic,
exactly. Axios called me that, I think, once. So I'll take it.
There you go.
But yeah, so it's not a focus for us today, but I think undoubtedly like we want to support our customers across every payment rail that's relevant to them. And if the volumes of these things become relevant, like we'll be right there with us.
Alan, so I think it was your partner, Matt, that was the investor in Bridge, but I'm sure you've also quite a bit about stablecoins, just given that was in your portfolio and stuff too. What are your thoughts on this?
Look, I think Oban put it well in the sense that like for us right now, at least from a US and Canada perspective, right, in our current markets, it's probably not the most relevant. I think where stablecoins become really interesting is when we start talking about international, right? Especially, we do a lot of work in Latin America. Bridge, you mentioned, a lot of their customers were in Latin America. In those markets, stablecoins are actually very important, right? They're a very important way, not just to do transactions with merchants like consumer merchant, but also employees getting paid out, right, in stablecoins, holding savings in stablecoins, dealing with international remittances, right? So that's actually, I think if you look at the growth rate of stablecoins in some of these emerging markets, particularly in Latin America, you're seeing an incredible adoption. And to the extent that Spade eventually does some work, I think this is probably, Oban will know better than I do, but I think this is probably years down the road here. But to the extent that we do go into some of these international markets, and ultimately we want, or our customers want to see data from merchants that may include stablecoin as a rail, right? Because we do cards, we do ACH, we do wires, we do RTP. And maybe there's a world down the road where stablecoins is a fourth or fifth rail. I could see that potentially being interesting to our customers, and actually it could actually be a very, very large part of business in that market, right? If we eventually go there. So, but I think Oban's absolutely right. Look, I think we got to stay focused. We're a small company. I think what are we now, Oban? Like 22, 23 people, something like that, right? So. More than
25 maybe.
Oh, 25. Okay. You guys have grown 25% since we led the beat.
They're putting the money to use, Alan. They're putting the money to use.
I love it. That's what we're here for, right? So, but yeah, look, I think it's one of those things where if and when that becomes a goal for Spade to go internationally and go to some of these markets, then it may be relevant. And in the meantime, I think stablecoins in general certainly have a role to play. And as we've seen in some of our portfolio companies, and we're very interested in those applications. But I think it's probably a couple years for Spade.
Okay. And I actually want to ask all three of you this final question that I have. And it's the biggest advice you'd have for someone that is like a new graduate and looking to get into fintech. And the reason I want to ask all three of you is like, Lauren, you have a sales role. And I think so much recently about, I would hate to be a college student just graduating right now, because all the roles that are getting eliminated are ones that are by AI, are the ones that are largely for, new people into the system. So what advice do you have for someone that is, either an undergrad or an MBA just getting started out in either venture capital or at a fintech in particular, to be able to still get into the system and do well like all three of you have?
I think I have always felt like the thing that I've tried to do with my life is just like go where you can learn a lot. And I don't think at a time, I guess the world we're at right now where the future seems pretty uncertain, I think that's usually the best way to approach it. Like, I don't come from tons of pedigree. Like, you look around, lots of fancy founders. I wouldn't describe myself as that. And I think a big part of where we are today at Spade is just like willingness to just like do the dirty work and like go where there's interesting and things to learn. And I think when you're looking at opportunities at a time when there's a lot of uncertainty, I think trying to just like build your own knowledge and things you appreciate and like collect more information and like build yourself, I think is a surefire way to have a very interesting career and also expose yourself to things that like might be overlooked or underappreciated. Like, yeah, you can go work at like the fastest growing, hottest AI company, or you can find these interesting things that really like spark your interest that you're going to be willing to like work really hard at, because just because something is like the coolest place to work because like your dinner party conversations are great and has a great valuation does not mean it's going to be fulfilling or interesting for you or your life. And I think really sort of focusing on what you find interesting and just like digging there and trying to find places you can learn, I think is the highest leverage use of your of certainly I think of my time that's ever been. And especially if you're earlier in your career, I think that's how you can do the most interesting work, is by prioritizing that, like a pursuit of like knowledge and understanding versus a pursuit of like like flashy titles or things like that. And I think that's something I see reflected in a lot of the founders and the people I respect who have sort of taking winding roads to get where they are. That would be mine.
Well, I started my career, for a moment, I wanted to be a pro sailor. That didn't really work out, but that's why I still commit a lot of time to it. So sorry, Oban. But then I went to Mass Mutual and, I was a financial advisor, but that role is really interesting because it does have the big company opportunity of getting sales training, which I think is really, really important. But then also you're in business for yourself. So you have to figure everything out the hard way. And I look at that role and think that's a little cringy for me to look back at, but it did give me so much exposure and experience. I just don't know that a 23-year-old really is in a position to tell people how to protect themselves adequately. But I think that's the thing I would tell people to look out for is you need to find a sales playbook if you want to be in sales, but you also have to have the opportunity to get very in the weeds. I think some people go to really, really large companies that have very, very robust playbooks, and that's great for some elements of things, but it doesn't get you as in the weeds on the specific elements of the thing that you're selling. And especially in fintech, I think that's a superpower, really understanding very deeply how the product works. I always say I moonlight in product. I think that that's the thing that you kind of have to do to really understand what you might be able to sell in the future, what conversation to seed, how to ask the right discovery questions. And so, maybe in today's world, that looks like joining a startup, even on a technical CSM role, or a junior analyst product role where you really get to understand how the sausage is made.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, great feedback. I have sort of two different thoughts. One is more meta and one is more practical. I think the first thing is just because as I think back, I was kind of a late bloomer. I always had a lot of different interests, and I didn't really kind of fully know exactly what I want to do. And I think a lot of people coming out of college are early in their career are kind of like that. I think the thing that I kind of wish I'd focused on more is like find the things that you're like really, really passionate about, where like work doesn't feel like work, right? Where you're just doing it because you love it. You're spending all your time outside of your 9 to 5 exploring that idea, that hobby, that interest, or whatever it is. Ideally, it'd be something that's also hard, right? Because like the intersection of things you're passionate about and things that are also really, really hard, the sort of overlap, the sort of Venn diagram there is, I think, where a lot of the value in the world comes from, is at that intersect. But sort of focused on finding things that you love and that you're just passionate about, that where that 9 to 5 or that work doesn't become work. It's just sort of like becomes a lifelong like passion for that, for what that thing is. I was just gonna say, and the other like very like tactical thing, I think, especially right now in 2026, is like just with the AI tooling and the AI capabilities that are out there, like I think you got to own those things, and you got to be willing to like experiment and kind of become, I think Bill Gurley said this well, become like the very best AI version of yourself that you can be in whatever kind of like job you're in, whatever industry you're in, because I think the people who adopt this technology are going to be much more productive than their sort of average peer. And you're going to get a lot more opportunities for advancement and for taking on some new projects. And you'll just see a lot more early in your career. If you adopt this stuff, because you become more efficient, more productive, you'll be a sort of a rising star in the company. So I think like whatever role you're in, whatever industry, just like be the very like earliest adopter of this technology, because we're in this like juncture here where like the rest of the world is not going to catch up as quickly, right? And if you have a window here of 2 or 3 years, you can really accelerate. And I think that's just something that every person coming out of college should be thinking about.
Also very good advice. There was one piece of advice I got is think about the job you want after this next job. So like if you want to be a sales manager or something, like think about what you need to learn in that sales role in order to get like, always think about what tools you're going to need to get to that job that you ultimately want, especially early on in your career. If you want to be a founder, think about finding a role that's a chief of staff or something like that. If you want to be an investor like Alan, think about going to maybe investment banking or consulting, where you're diving deep into these industries, etc. I think that was good advice too. But all of that was really good advice. So I hope people, especially the younger ones that are listening, take all that to heart, and it can help some folks that are listening to this too. But thank you so much for joining me, especially, the day we're filming this, the day after Money 2020 Fintech Meetup, the other Vegas conference. So, people have less sleep and have been out in a highly oxygenated and dehydrated environment. So I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
No, thank you. It was great.
Yeah, real fun. Thank you so much.